What would you do if security stopped you at the airport, insisting you didn't belong, only to realize you held more power than they ever imagined? This is the story of Grace Turner, a sharp and determined legal counsel for a major airline, whose unassuming demeanor led to an unforgettable encounter. It was a breezy Thursday morning at Los Angeles International Airport. Grace Turner, a 34-year-old legal counsel for Pacific Sky Airlines, was on her way to a meeting with the company's executive team in San Francisco. As someone who preferred a low profile, she often traveled without the perks of first class or VIP treatment. Dressed in a simple black blazer, jeans, and carrying a modest leather briefcase, Grace looked like any other traveler. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she wore flats instead of heels, a practical choice for long travel days. Grace had arrived early, breezing through the TSA checkpoint with her pre-check clearance. She was en route to her gate when something unusual happened. As she walked past a bustling coffee shop, a uniformed airport security officer called out, "Excuse me, ma'am, can you stop for a moment?" Grace turned, surprised. "Yes, is there a problem?" The officer, a stern-looking man in his mid-40s named Richard, crossed his arms. "Where's your ticket?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "It's on my phone." "Why?" Richard's gaze was scrutinizing. "You're walking toward the restricted access area. Passengers are required to show their boarding passes." Grace furrowed her brow. "I've already been through security. I don't need to show it again unless I'm boarding." Richard's expression hardened. "Ma'am, without a ticket you can't be here. I need you to step aside for further questioning." A small crowd began to gather, some passengers curious about the unfolding scene. Grace remained calm but firm. "This is a misunderstanding. I'm a Pacific Sky Airlines employee, and I'm heading to a company meeting." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're an employee? Do you have an ID to prove that?" Grace reached into her briefcase and pulled out her airline-issued identification badge. "Here. This should clear things up." Richard barely glanced at the badge before shaking his head. "This isn't a boarding pass. I'm going to need more than this." Grace sighed, her patience thinning. "My ticket is on my phone. Let me pull it up for you." As she unlocked her phone and opened the Airline app, Richard radioed for backup. "We have a potential trespasser in Concourse B. Need assistance." Grace's jaw tightened. "Trespasser? Are you serious?" Richard ignored her, his hand resting on his radio. Within moments, another officer arrived, a younger woman named Dana, who seemed more approachable. "What's going on here?" Dana asked, looking between Richard and Grace. "She doesn't have a ticket," Richard said flatly. Dana turned to Grace, her tone calmer. "Ma'am, do you have proof of your reservation?" Grace held up her phone, showing her boarding pass. "Here it is. I've been trying to explain that I'm an employee traveling for work." Dana studied the screen, her expression softening. "It's valid." Richard frowned but didn't back down. "If she's an employee, why didn't she use the staff entrance? And why does she look like a regular passenger?" Grace's eyes flashed with irritation. "Because I don't need special treatment to do my job. Isn't that what you're supposed to be protecting here? Equal treatment?" The tension between Grace and the airport security officers grew as more passengers stopped to watch the scene unfold. Grace, still holding up her phone with her valid boarding pass, felt her frustration mounting. She had dealt with challenging situations in courtrooms, but this level of unwarranted scrutiny was new. Dana, the younger officer, took a step closer, lowering her voice. "I see your boarding pass is valid, ma'am. But Officer Richard here insists there's a protocol issue. Can you help clarify why this misunderstanding might have happened?" Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Look, I understand you're doing your job, but I followed all the procedures. I went through TSA with my pre-check clearance, my boarding pass is valid, and I'm heading to my gate like any other passenger." Richard crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "But you're an employee, right? Why didn't you identify yourself as such earlier?" Grace raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor tinged with sarcasm. Because being an employee doesn't exempt me from following the same rules as everyone else. I don't expect special treatment, nor do I need it. At that moment, another figure joined the scene. A tall man in a suit with a Pacific Sky Airlines badge clipped to his lapel. It was David Fisher, the airline's regional operations manager. He had been informed of the situation by another employee who witnessed the commotion. David's eyes widened as he saw Grace. "Miss Turner?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and concern. Grace turned to him, visibly relieved. "David, I'm glad you're here. Can you help clear this up? Your security team seems to think I'm trespassing." David's expression shifted to one of disbelief as he looked at Richard. "Do you realize who you're speaking to?" Richard hesitated, his confidence wavering. "She claims to be an employee, but—" David cut him off. "Grace Turner is the airline's lead legal counsel. She's one of the highest-ranking officials at Pacific Sky Airlines." The crowd fell silent. Dana's eyes widened in realization, and even Richard's stern expression faltered. I didn't know," Richard stammered, glancing at Grace. "That much is clear," Grace replied, her tone sharp, but controlled. "Instead of listening and assessing the situation, you jumped to conclusions based on assumptions." David turned to Richard, his voice firm. "You owe Ms. Turner an apology, not just for this inconvenience, but for the disrespect you've shown." Richard's face reddened. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to." Grace held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't need excuses. I need professionalism. You had every opportunity to verify my information before escalating the situation. This isn't just about me. It's about how you treat everyone who passes through this airport." Dana, stepping forward, addressed Grace. "Ms. Turner, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. This could have been handled much better." Grace nodded, her tone softening slightly. "Thank you, Officer Dana. It's not about being perfect. It's about treating people with respect." David gestured toward the gate. "Grace, let me personally escort you to your flight. I'll make sure you aren't delayed further." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, David. I appreciate it." As they walked away, the crowd began to disperse, whispering about what had just happened. Richard stood rooted in place, his earlier confidence replaced with regret. As Grace and David walked toward the gate, the tension from the incident lingered in the air. David, sensing her frustration, turned to her. "Grace, I'm so sorry about what happened back there. This should never have escalated the way it did." Grace sighed, her pace steady. "David, it's not about me. Incidents like this happen to people every day, people who don't have titles or someone to step in for them. What bothers me most is the lack of professionalism and the assumptions made." David nodded, his expression serious. "You're absolutely right. This isn't just a misunderstanding. It's a failure in how we train our staff. I'll make sure it's addressed." As they approached the gate, Grace glanced at her watch. She still had time before boarding, but her mind was far from the meeting she was headed to. "David, I'd like to speak to airport management about this," she said firmly. "Not as an executive, but as someone who believes things need to change." David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll arrange it. Let me make a few calls." Within the hour, Grace was sitting in a conference room near the terminal. Across from her were the airport's customer service manager, Rebecca Alvarez, and the head of security, Tom Hendricks. Rebecca started the conversation, her tone apologetic. "Ms. Turner, we've reviewed the situation, and I want to personally apologize for what you experienced. It's clear we need to do better." Tom, the head of security, looked uncomfortable but spoke up. "We train our officers to be thorough, but it's clear that assumptions were made here. That's unacceptable." Grace leaned forward, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't about one officer or one incident. It's about a systemic issue in how passengers are treated, particularly when they don't fit a certain profile. The lack of proper communication and escalation protocols make situations like this far too common." Rebecca nodded, taking notes. You're absolutely right. What would you suggest as immediate steps we can take? Start with better training, Grace replied without hesitation. Focus on de-escalation, clear communication, and treating every individual with respect. And ensure there's accountability, not just for security officers, but for everyone who interacts with passengers. Tom cleared his throat. We'll make it a priority, Ms. Turner. I'll personally oversee the review of our training programs. Word of the incident spread quickly among the airport staff. Dana, the younger officer who had intervened, approached Grace before she boarded her flight. Ms. Turner, I just wanted to thank you, Dana said. Not just for how you handled everything, but for making sure this becomes a lesson for all of us. Grace smiled softly. Thank you, Dana. You showed empathy and professionalism when it mattered most. Keep that up. It'll take you far. As Grace boarded her flight, she couldn't help but reflect on the events of the day. What started as an inconvenience had turned into an opportunity to spark change, not just for herself, but for everyone who walked through the airport. Little did she know, her actions would inspire a ripple effect, leading to policy changes that would improve the travel experience for countless passengers. As Grace settled into her seat on the flight, the events of the morning still weighed on her. She gazed out of the airplane window, watching the ground crew bustle around below. For years, her role as legal counsel for Pacific Sky Airlines had been about contracts, negotiations, and policies. But today had been different. Today, she had been reminded of the importance of dignity and respect, not just in the workplace, but in everyday life. Halfway through the flight, a flight attendant approached Grace with a warm smile. Ms. Turner, I wanted to let you know the captain is aware of what happened earlier. On behalf of the crew, we're truly sorry for the way you were treated. Grace looked up, slightly surprised. Thank you. That means a lot. The attendant handed her a small handwritten note. This is from the captain. He asked me to give it to you. Unfolding the note, Grace read the thoughtful message. Ms. Turner, thank you for your calm and dignified approach to what should never have happened. Your grace under pressure is an example to us all. We are proud to have you as part of the Pacific Sky family. Grace smiled, tucking the note into her briefcase. It was a small gesture, but it reminded her of why she loved her job and the people she worked with. Back at the airport, the ripple effects of Grace's encounter were already being felt. Tom Hendricks, the head of security, had issued a memo to his team outlining immediate changes to their training program. In the break room, Dana sat with Richard, the officer who had confronted Grace earlier. Can you believe all this attention? Richard muttered, sipping his coffee. Dana gave him a pointed look. It's not attention, Richard. It's accountability. You didn't just inconvenience someone important. You made assumptions about her without taking a moment to listen. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. I messed up. I get it. Dana leaned forward. What matters is that you learn from it. People like Ms. Turner don't hold grudges. They push for change. And we're lucky she's one of the good ones. A week later, Grace received an email from Rebecca Alvarez, the customer service manager at the airport. Dear Ms. Turner, I wanted to personally thank you for your feedback and the conversation we had. We've already begun implementing new training sessions focused on de-escalation and respectful communication. Your input has sparked a much-needed change, and I hope you'll see the difference the next time you travel. Reading the email, Grace felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't about the apology or the policy changes. It was about knowing that her voice had made a difference. That evening, Grace sat in her living room, watching the sun set over Los Angeles. Her phone buzzed with a message from David Fisher. Grace, just wanted to let you know we're rolling out a new respect and dignity campaign for all staff. Your experience reminded us why it's so important. Thank you for everything. Grace leaned back, a contented smile on her face. The day's events had been challenging, but they had also been a reminder of the values she stood for. In the end, It wasn't about her title or position. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. And knowing that her actions had inspired others to do the same made every moment worthwhile. Because respect and dignity aren't just corporate buzzwords. They're the foundation of how we treat each other, no matter where we come from or who we are.